Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the wonderful book Super Mafia, Organized Crime Threatens America by Jonathan Harris. This time starting a new chapter, Chapter 3, Part 1. And the theme or the title is called Tidal Wave of Drugs. This is very fascinating because this is the time when I think changes really happened within the mafia that led to their downfall. In fact, if you've seen the movie Goodfellas, you know that there's a prominent scene there where the main guy is essentially doing drugs, but he's been warned multiple times not to sell them, not to be involved in them, and so on, because of the incredible controversy, fines, jail time, and so on that's associated with it. But he did it, and that led to that organization going down. That's the same thing that I think happened overall. So it's interesting that there's going to be this chapter here dedicated to it. So let's see if my theory is right, if the eventual move into drugs eventually change things for the mafia for the worse. And let's go ahead and let's start part one. The first subtopic is the incredible statistics. So here's what it says. Between $80 and $120 billion a year. That is the mind-boggling amount Americans spent on illegal drugs. It is about equal to the combined profit of America's 500 largest corporations, according to former U.S. Attorney General William French Smith. Marijuana was until very recently the most popular drug among the young, but new surveys of high school students show a considerable drop among pot smokers in that age group. Users at all age levels are reckoned at between 20 and 30 million, making this still the most widely used of all drugs. It is now the second largest cash drop after corn grown in the United States. Heroin junkies in the United States today are estimated at between 500,000 and 2 million. From 4 to perhaps 15 million Americans abuse cocaine. Half of these cokeheads are between 18 and 24. The effects have been tragic and they are getting worse. Deaths from drug dependence and hospital emergency treatments for overdoses have more than doubled in the larger cities over the past years. Consider the unique case of New York City. 5 mafia families dominate its drug trade, which accounts for about half the national total. At $45 billion a year, the drug take is nearly double the city's entire retail trade, which earns only $24.5 billion. New York's junkie population has increased by 50% since 1978. There is now 1 junkie for every 43 resident New Yorkers. Then the next one is the mafia's changing role. The mafia plays a controlling part in all this, though it has no monopoly. Other ethnic gangs have moved in on one piece or another of this drug action. Mafia relations with these Black, Hispanic, Chinese, and other gangs are in a constant state of flux. In the 1960s, blacks and mafioso fought a bitter war in the streets for control of the Harlem drug trade. The better organized, better armed mafia mobsters made good on their claim in blood. Their supremacy as wholesale suppliers to the major heroin dealers has never been seriously questioned since. There is a popular myth to the effect that certain top bosses in the mafia have refused to get into the drug traffic. Mario Puzo's best-selling novel The Godfather and the 2 smash hit movies based on it helped spread this delusion. So did books like A Man of Honor, the 1983 autobiography of former New York Mafia family chief Joe Bonanno. Bonanno called drug dealing this filthy business and insisted that he never allowed any of his family members to engage in it. Such men supposedly preferred the more traditional rackets, feeling those were somehow less shameful. Authorities questioned on this point scoffed at the notion that mafia bosses were ever worried much about the rights and wrongs of it. With the potential profits so enormous, all the mafia families have long since overcome any scruples that might have ever troubled them. Even members of Joe Bonanno's family have been convicted for narcotics violations. A detailed 1983 report by the New York City Police Department also said the Bonanno mob was deeply rooted in the importation of narcotics and would probably continue to be one of the main sources of supply for the New York area. The temptations are understandable, for the profits are nothing less than astronomical. A kilo, which is about 2.2 pounds of almost 100% pure heroin purchased in Bangkok, goes for 10,000 to 12,000 wholesale in the United States. By the time this merchandise hits the streets, after being cut and recut to 3.5% purity, its gross value is about $2 million. A pound of cocaine purchased for $2,800 in Colombia is worth anywhere from $900 to $1,800 an ounce within the United States. An investigative reporter, Nicholas Pileggi, noted in New York Magazine, December 13, 1982, at this point, heroin is worth more than gold. Last week, gold was selling for $435 an ounce, while that much heroin cost $10,000. Howard Abedinsky described the lure in his book Organized Crime. A typical wholesaler with 20 kilos of heroin after expenses can net more than $500,000 in cash for an operation which he sanctioned, financed, and organized, but in which he had no physical part. Heroin is the American Mafia's chief import and also its main point of contact and cooperation with the Sicilian Mafia. The Sicilians arranged for shipments of the raw material from the Middle East Golden Crescent, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to the laboratories in Sicily. Sicilians and Americans then cooperate in smuggling the refined product across the Atlantic to the United States. According to Italian authorities, the value of these shipments in a single year, 1981, totaled $863 million. This is today's Sicilian connection, and it is a big change from the old days. Until the early 1970s, the American mafioso were dependent for their heroin supply on Corsican and French smugglers, the French connection. The Americans' role was limited to buying the drug after its arrival. Today, working with their close allies in Sicily, they are deeply involved at every stage, from the planning and financing of shipments to the importation and final distribution. New York is the biggest single port of entry, but not the only one. Of the approximately 8,800 pounds of heroin that the U.S. Customs Service estimates as coming into the United States in a single recent year, half was smuggled through Mafia-infiltrated freight handling facilities at Kennedy Airport and the New York waterfront. But the Mafia is big enough and flexible enough to have other sources as well. Its connections enable the mob to obtain heroin from Southeast Asia too. One of the biggest drug busts in recent years occurred in August 1983 when 7 men, reputedly linked to the New York Gambino family, were charged with smuggling hundreds of pounds of 98% pure Southeast Asian heroin. The case was broken by FBI wiretaps of hundreds of hours of conversations. The Lucchese family, smallest of the New York gangs, even brings heroin in by the way of South America. Next segment is called New Rivals. On the West Coast, a new factor has recently entered the picture in the form of the Yakuza. This is Japan's organized crime syndicate, and it controls a steadily increasing share of the Southeast Asian sources of heroin. The Tongs, i.e. secret societies of America's Chinatowns, most notably those of New York and San Francisco, have also begun to play an important part in this commerce. There is even some participation by recently arrived Vietnamese refugees. Heroin from Mexico is once again on the increase. In the mid-1970s, the Mexican authorities had almost stamped out the cultivation of opium poppies, but with the demand for heroin as strong as ever in the United States, the profit lure has proved too powerful. Today, the heroin refined out of the renewed poppy crop is moving across the United States in ever-mounting quantities. It arrives under the gang or the control of Mexican and Chicano Mexican-American gangs. Once inside the United States, a large part of this brown sugar is turned over to the Mafia for distribution. And that is the key. Distribution. Whoever brings the stuff in and wherever it comes from, anyone hoping to get large quantities distributed much sooner or later strikes some sort of deal with the Mafia. No other organization commands a coast-to-coast network nearly as complete or as efficient. Others may make their own distribution arrangements and may even control portions of the market in some parts of the country. But when the really big money flows, the mafia is usually there to claim and get its cut. Let's go ahead and let's pause that here, and then let's talk about part one of this chapter, chapter 3, Tidal Wave of Drugs. Once again, from the book Super Mafia, Organized Crime Threatens America by Jonathan Harris. And let's talk about that now. Interesting, right? It already shatters the illusion. So yeah, it was the other movie also, The Godfather, which I noted that too. There's a famous scene in there where the Godfather is basically asked to join a new business venture, but he turns it down, saying that it involves drugs, and doing that type of business will scare away many of the politicians and then also bring down police upon them, unlike what they're doing now, as if anything involves activity outside of drugs. He just considers it too much of a taboo. And again, I was alluding earlier to Goodfellas. There you had that situation where Paul Vadio's crew, at least if you believe again what was listed there within the movie and the book, Wise Guy, that Paul Vadio had basically told his crew to never ever deal in drugs, mainly because of the large amount of fines and jail time associated with them. They could do a lot of other things, but anything involving dealing with drugs, that's where things take a more serious level. I think also because it harkens to making things bad for the neighborhood. There's the idea that if you have stuff being sold, like let's say on the market, and it involves fenced goods, or maybe it involves stuff that's stolen, or maybe other things like booze or whatever, that's fine. Like there's nothing really harmful to the community that they're in. But if it involves drugs, then you're actually creating bad situations for the very people that live within the community. And I think that's why they also wanted to stay away from it. But obviously, Henry Hill and the others, they didn't care. They did it. And then eventually it led to the downfall associated with Paul Vadio. And then you had Tommy DeSimone. And then you had Jimmy Conway and others, all because of the drug trade on there. Eventually, Henry Hill was caught. And he was caught with drugs in his hand. And he ended up doing that type of informant status, which led to everyone else going to jail. So yeah, I think that's why it plays such a prominent role in terms of being against things. But who knows? This chapter is again stating that the mafia was adopting this from the get-go, like from the 60s going on forward. So it'll be interesting to see how much of that plays out through the rest of the chapter itself. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.